Stanford University.
Yeah, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. It's really exciting to be here in a very different context from what I'm used to. Originally, I had wanted to talk about social-cultural drivers and barriers to adaptation to climate change, which is a topic that I'm really fascinated by, in particular religion and vulnerability. But I realized that probably, and of course this is a really important topic, but it wouldn't really represent the adaptation that most of you would probably be expecting to hear from me. And so then that observation made me realize that there is a more fundamental and possibly more pressing issue that needs to be addressed first, which is what adaptation am I talking about? I have a lot of opportunity to talk about adaptation in Asia, which is obviously where I'm based and where I do most of my work. And that's where the topic is very popular, and I think the perceived understanding of it is very low. People really think that they don't understand what to do about adaptation, even though maybe they do, but they don't think they do. But sadly, when I speak to practitioners, for example, if I talk to Red Cross, Red Crescent societies, national members, I feel like I have little concrete to offer them when I talk about adaptation. And I can see that people are extremely confused sometimes and really trying to figure out what are the links with what I'm talking about in terms of adaptation theory. How does that link to their work and what their realities are? Some people have learned about adaptation, but they seem to have a certain idea that doesn't match with what I'm talking about. And so after many years of doing research on adaptation and talking to practitioners, I realized that there are a number of different schools of thought about adaptation. And they seem to be sort of ticking along and never really coming into interaction with each other, almost as if sort of adaptation mutations are cropping up all over the place. And I feel like we can't continue like this if we want to bring our knowledge forward, because we really want to try to identify concrete answers to these practical questions. And so for this reason, I began to explore the different understandings of adaptation in order to see what the real distinctions are. So the talk today is based on a paper that I'm in the middle of doing with Jochen Hinkel, who's a researcher at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, as well as findings that have come out of other work that I've done over the years. And as has already been mentioned, the work that I do is primarily focused on finding the links between adaptation to climate change and development. So before I start, I just want to say if anybody has a hard time hearing me, there are plenty of seats in the front, so you're welcome to move down. So in the process of growing attempts to understand adaptation, the discourse seems to have become instead increasingly obscure. And I'm not sure if this is your experience also, but I feel that a wide range of local, national, international, and global organizations are involved in this adaptation debate, but each seem to be interpreting and applying the concept in ways that are suitable to their needs. The term adaptation is therefore used to refer to different types of activities that seem to be found scattered all along spatial and temporal scales. And many feel that there have been sufficient conceptual discussions on adaptation, that we already know what it means. But after comparing different actors' understandings of adaptation, I feel that this statement is false. Yes, each set of actors has developed an understanding of adaptation, but these are not the same. At the same time, there's a lot of pressure to move beyond these conceptual discussions because we shouldn't delay action further and we need to act before it's too late. Scientific uncertainty about the impacts of climate change is no reason not to address the causes of vulnerability. But while I agree with this, and I support this thinking for reasons that will hopefully become clear as I discuss the entry points to adaptation, I think we need to move with caution. Therefore, we must not assume that we can leave the conceptual debates behind us. I think this would lead toward encouraging this propagation of these adaptation mutations. So I want to start by presenting my 3 key messages to you up front, which frame my argument. If I get the right button, I can do it. Let's see, okay. So when I say that all actors have different understandings of adaptation, this is what I mean. Adaptation is, of course, a really broad concept that can mean everything. But as a consequence, it can also mean almost nothing. And in the context of climate change, adaptation could appropriately be used in all sorts of ways. For example, we also need to adapt our lifestyles to a more low-carbon pathway. So, I mean, this refers to greenhouse gas emissions, but it's a form of adaptation. Also, adaptation has sort of been owned by many different actors who feel that they all have the appropriate position to stake adaptation out for themselves. And this has caused some competition in terms of whose definition of adaptation is the right one. And finally, so much money is being poured into adaptation right now that it really is worth going the extra mile to create a space within adaptation for yourself, for your organization, and your interests. But naturally, the problem with these divergent interpretations is that we then end up with not only one concept of adaptation, but several. And in my experience I work a lot with development projects, I work a lot with capacity building projects in Asia and Africa and Latin America. And everybody is very interested in adaptation. And in my experience, the most common outcome of these different understandings is miscommunication, where different people coming from different communities of practice end up speaking nonsense to each other when discussing adaptation. And I've been in several of these conversations. I've had this experience in a number of countries where I've been working with government representatives, for example, in Bhutan, in Ethiopia, in Cambodia, in Nicaragua. One step higher in terms of the adverse implications of these different interpretations is, of course, that there's wasted investment, where money is possibly put aside to do adaptation by one type of actor, say a donor agency, and then implemented by another agency, another actor, such as an NGO. And in this case, where you might have different understandings, different interpretations of adaptation, and this might become evident if somebody notices this in original communication. But given that many of these investments are meant to yield results quickly, documents are shifted really rapidly, and so this kind of miscommunication might never be noticed. So projects can go through with unclear objectives, or these objectives might be clear, but they still might be clear to each party, but different. But finally, what I consider to be the most serious risk associated with these different understandings of adaptation is that there's maladaptation, which means, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, maladaptation is really where you end up with increased vulnerability in climate change, where you think you're adapting, but ultimately you're increasing your exposure, your sensitivity. And this means that not only are efforts in vain, but they're increasing vulnerability. And this could be as a result of, for example, only focus on climate, or a focus on the near term, or often a lack of understanding of system dynamics, or a lack of concern for the rest of the system. Which means that questions like adaptation to what, or adaptation by whom, or adaptation of what are not answered, or have different answers for the different actors involved. So, we argue that rather than agreeing with the view that we need to move beyond these conceptual discussions, it's necessary to move beyond the assumption that there is a common understanding, and instead recognize the need to examine what adaptation means for the relevant actors. So before we go any further, I want to just set the scene of the adaptation debate for you a little bit. And this figure is taken from the publication McGray et al. From 2007, Weathering the Storm. And it shows a spectrum of adaptation. And it illustrates, in my view, the reason for this debate. Here you have a spectrum of adaptation that ranges from focusing only on impacts to focusing only on vulnerability, or the drivers of vulnerability. And I think this figure makes it clear that there are two distinct approaches to adaptation that have a range of variations in between. And these are apparent in literature, in policy, and in practice. So at one extreme, you have an approach that is focused on creating response mechanisms to the impacts of climate change and variability. And at the other is an approach that is focused on adjusting livelihoods to reduce exposure and sensitivity to climate change and variability. And these are not the same. The impacts approach places climate change impacts at the center, obviously, and attempts to identify ways in which distinct impacts can be reduced. The types of activities in this approach include, for example, building sea wall defenses in response to sea level rise, or developing irrigation systems in response to reduced rainfall. But the vulnerability approach, on the other hand, is more holistic in that it targets the underlying factors that are causing the impacts to be harmful. And this approach recognizes that there are other processes ongoing, and that these processes influence the process of adaptation, as well as the effects of climate change over time. The vulnerability approach, unfortunately, requires dealing with unequal wealth distribution, gender discrimination, and cultural belief systems, among very many other things. And these are already some of the most challenging development issues, which history has already shown that we haven't been able to address very well. So it forces you to consider underlying issues, aiming for a more sustainable solution. But the resulting question from this is, what is the difference between normal development and adaptation in that case? The other thing is that the vulnerability approach is really beyond the mandate of most climate change policy or projects. And it's also massive in scope. So the impacts approach, where adaptation is sort of an additional process that's fitted on top of other development activities, suits these existing policy and funding structures much better. And it also addresses climate change directly. So, but on the other hand, this impacts approach can be considered, in my view, far too superficial to have a long-term effect. And instead, efforts to respond to climate change really need to begin on a more basic level, such as reducing hunger or improving access to resources. But we know that climate change and even climate variability are not isolated processes, and they can't be effectively addressed without addressing other processes that are also influencing people's well-being. So I argue very strongly for a vulnerability approach rather than an impacts approach. In my view, this vulnerability approach, in this case, scientific uncertainty regarding climate change is not really as much of an obstacle because the emphasis is on tackling existing development problems. But not everyone agrees with that vulnerability reduction should be the focus of adaptation. And again, not everyone understands these differences in the same way. I think it's important to recognize that adaptation is many things to many people and different things to most. And while you look at when you look at the trends in adaptation, which I consider to be the topics within adaptation that are currently given the most focus, you see that these are also very different. So if my focus is on financing adaptation, for example, I might not just easily be able to speak to somebody who's working on cities and adaptation. There's so many different issues to consider. But at the same time, at the moment, these things are all lumped together as adaptation. So I'm just going to go through what I see as the 7 trends of adaptation at the moment. You could say that mainstreaming adaptation was the first sub-theme to emerge in the adaptation debate. It could be argued that this mainstream discussion was fueled by the lack of provisions for adaptation under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and also in existing development agendas. So because of this, it was considered necessary to integrate adaptation into existing programs and projects, because this would integrate climate change awareness. Mainstreaming takes place on various levels. It can mean integrating climate change into development projects, or, for example, incorporating climate change into development programs. I mean, it can also mean that staff members of development agencies are all made aware of climate change and have to think about climate change as they plan their projects. The other way you can talk about mainstreaming is retrofitting initiatives to make sure they're climate proof, which is another word or another term that's used often to describe mainstreaming. So in this case, projects should take into account changes in conditions like ecosystems and politics that result from climate change. the discussion on measuring effectiveness of adaptation, or metrics, or adaptation metrics, has emerged out of the need for funding agencies to understand whether the adaptation projects they're funding are having an impact. And it's somehow ironic, following years of debate, especially among these agencies, about how to implement adaptation, which was really characterized by doubt and concern about the additionality aspect of adaptation. Agencies have gone ahead and implemented adaptation projects anyway. So now they need to figure out whether what they did worked, and they need to understand how to measure this. And measuring the effectiveness of these interventions has been proposed as a useful approach, but I don't really agree, because I see that the time span for a lot of these projects doesn't really offer you enough to really see if you've had any impact in terms of adaptation. And adaptation indicators have also been proposed as a way of being able to assess adaptation. Another very trendy topic is the integration of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And for years, the disaster risk reduction community has really tirelessly lobbied the climate change community to inform about the valuable lessons for adaptation that could be found in the centuries of experience with reducing and responding to disaster risk. And I think that you could say that disaster risk reduction has been reflected as an integral part of climate change responses now in the UNFCCC's Bali Action Plan, which is what's guiding negotiations now for post-Kyoto. And it could be said in some ways that this battle has been won now. Finally, climate change experts are attending disaster risk meetings, and disaster risk reduction experts are invited to climate change meetings. And climate change is also a focus of many humanitarian agencies who recognize that climate change is going to cause more of the same, but also slightly different hazards. And you might be aware that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has just agreed to go ahead with a special report on extreme events and disasters, which signals that even the climate science community has recognized the importance of understanding how climate change and disasters are linked, particularly in terms of responses. So the kinds of questions that are discussed in this area are really whether it's possible to adapt to extreme events, and how do coping strategies in times of crisis relate to adaptation. And these are obviously questions that I grapple with a lot, so I'm particularly interested in this topic. But naturally, there are also areas where disaster risk reduction and adaptation to climate change don't overlap, clearly where we're dealing with non-climate related risks. But it can be questioned to what extent humanitarian response is legitimately an adaptation to risk. Another super hot topic is funding adaptation. And since the entry into force of the Kyoto Protocol in 2005, and then the subsequent adoption of the decision that on the Adaptation Fund, I'm not sure how familiar you all are with this, but you can ask me afterwards if it's confusing, the funding debate has taken off. In my view, the other factors that influence this include the new focus on adaptation, which came about after George Bush said that he wasn't going to sign the Kyoto Protocol or ratify the Kyoto Protocol in 2001, and a lot of activities that were related to reducing emissions became sort of stalled. And so adaptation really came up out of that within the UNFCCC context. And so this really kind of took some time to filter through, but has now emerged as the big topic. Related to this, and also sort of happening in parallel, is the restructuring of the Global Environment Facility, which is the funding mechanism of the UNFCCC. Their approach to funding adaptation was restructured into something called the Strategic Priority on Adaptation. So all in all, this has now meant that adaptation funding is one of the hottest topics. One of the debates is, for example, if official development assistance should be used for adaptation. But this goes back to the practical issue, which is how to distinguish between adaptation and development. And here, the question of what qualifies as adaptation is absolutely relevant. So a couple of more trends. One is adaptation knowledge management, which includes things like reproducing good adaptation practice and scaling up community-based adaptation, networking on adaptation to create partnerships, and guidelines, how-tos, and methodology compilations. something that actually SEI is very much involved in. It might seem that that adaptation knowledge management would serve to reconcile all of these different interpretations of adaptation. But it appears that it may, in fact, be having the opposite effect. Everybody wants to carve their own piece of the pie and create their own best adaptation knowledge management systems. And I think this is really where these institutional battles are being fought. And I know because we are involved in some of these. So another area that's getting a lot of attention is the economics of adaptation, which includes calculating the costs and benefits of adaptation or examining the different roles of the public and private sectors in adaptation. And finally, since 2007, the number of projects focused on urbanization and adaptation has really exploded. I'm particularly aware of this because everybody who's working on adaptation in cities wants to do some case study on Bangkok. And since I'm based there, we get a lot of requests to be involved in these projects. Rockefeller, Institute for Development Studies at the University of Sussex, OECD, among others, have all undertaken studies that relate to cities and adaptation to climate change. So I want to go ahead and just sort of focus on examples of two types of actors that I think are interesting to look at. What I've shown here is that there's a number of sub-themes to adaptation, and each of these clearly appeal to different actors. At the same time, the different actors come with their own ways of determining what adaptation means. So when examining different actors, Jochen and I, in our paper, were asking the following questions. How do these actors define adaptation to climate change? How does the actor currently contribute to the debate on adaptation to climate change? And what are their organizational goals? And a sub-question to that is, what is the capacity of the organization to undertake these goals? And what hinders their achievement? And this is because we're interested in understanding what motivates these actors. So the first example is of aid agencies, because they've really been extremely important in putting adaptation on the global policy agenda. This has particularly been the case in the UNFCCC context, where bi- and multilateral development agencies are playing an increasingly important role and have in many ways been the drivers of adaptation in that process so far. The UN Development Programme Adaptation Policy Framework, or APF, is a good example, but other agencies have also played important roles. They're interesting characters because they are proponents of mainstreaming, but at the same time, they have to battle with the UNFCCC's narrow focus on climate change impacts. And so in this way, they've sort of developed, I would say, somewhat contradictory approaches. On the one hand, they're eager to understand the impacts of their efforts through these metrics, for example. But because of the time constraints in their projects, they often have to narrow their emphasis to addressing experienced or expected impacts of climate change, rather than coordinating their efforts with all of their other poverty reduction-related efforts and other drivers of vulnerability. The second example that I want to give, and I want to emphasize that these are in some ways preliminary analysis because we're just sort of trying to look at who are the important actors here, are development NGOs. I think they're really interesting because although they've come relatively late on the scene, they really weren't involved very much in the beginning of the UNFCCC debates. They've appeared because through the realization that the UNFCCC is more of a development convention than an environment convention. So development NGOs like Oxfam, for example, have positioned themselves within the adaptation debate. But I think this has come following a long period where they have had to really justify why the work that they were doing was related to climate change. Obviously, this is mostly for funding reasons. This doesn't mean that the work they're doing is not inherently related to climate change. It is. But I find it quite interesting because I have a lot of experience answering responses from, or requests from development NGOs who want to know more about adaptation. And for example, when Oxfam Great Britain asked me to present on adaptation and vulnerability and wanted to know what is the most important thing, what can we do, how can we get into adaptation, my response to them was, well, focus on vulnerability reduction and just do more of what you're doing, but do it better and have a more long-term perspective, particularly in terms of the way they respond, their involvement in humanitarian response. rather than carving out a new program within Oxfam on adaptation only, because very much of what they're already doing supports reducing vulnerability to climate change. But it's interesting because development NGOs really do put adaptation at the center, and they recognize the links between with adaptation and development. So they also understand the importance of reducing vulnerability, but often they have little experience working with climate change, and with very small budgets, they try to do more with less, meaning that climate change gets a lot of lip service, but may not actually get much attention. Although I'm not sure Oxfam really fits into that small budget category, but there are others. So based on this preliminary analysis of these actors, it becomes evident that there are at least 6 important factors influencing how adaptation is understood. So this figure just has these 6 bubbles with these different factors, for those who aren't watching the slides. The motivation and interests of an actor come first. These are what drives the actor towards adaptation in the first place. It means that the actor sees a connection between adaptation and whatever existing activities they have. And this can be influenced by their understanding of the problem, which is the gray one, which is a little bit difficult to see right there. This means climate change as a problem, but also development problems. I think this influences how an actor understands where their interventions come from. Also, an actor's positioning refers to how they see themselves fitting into the context, the role that they see themselves playing, as well as the contributions that they feel that they can bring. At the same time, the target and objectives of the repertoire of activities that an actor has will influence how adaptation-related activities will benefit an actor's survival as an organization or institution. So it's a little bit on the selfish side. What do they think they can get out of this? But clearly, funding source also matters. Obviously, an organization that has to look for funding to survive will have a tendency to adjust to the trends that the trends of the moment that were the 7 points that I showed earlier. And finally, the policy framework within which an actor is located will influence how it relates to adaptation. So if an actor is functioning really within the UNFCCC context, that's what will guide their decisions on what they should do on adaptation and what adaptation means to them. So when trying to find a picture, yes, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but I'm going to mention it now because it's, I just recently put together a reader on adaptation to climate change with Ian Burton. And when we're trying to put a picture for this cover, find a picture that sort of described adaptation, that represented adaptation, we found that most of the things that were being sent to us represented some kind of infrastructure, some infrastructural adjustment. And for some, that's really how they would define adaptation. It's about infrastructural adjustment. But to others, as I've already explained, it means many other things as well. We can talk about institutions, we can talk about policies, we can talk about investment, livelihoods, services, attitudes and values, and education, for example. These are all things that need to adapt in order to reduce our vulnerability to climate change. And these are really also where we can have the greatest impact in terms of enhancing our capacity to deal with climate change. But how can we picture these? I think we still have a far way to go before we can identify concrete adaptation processes. So just to wrap up, as currently defined in the mainstream literature, adaptation to climate change involves many activities that contribute somehow to the goals of sustainable development. And the two are sometimes used interchangeably. However, this is both too broad and too narrow. Too broad because adaptation to climate change in the international policy context means adapting to the impacts of climate change and not to anything else. But it's too narrow because sustainable development articulates less clearly the need for this ongoing change and adjustment that is central to the idea of adaptation. The uniqueness of adaptation is really its ability not only to improve human well-being, but also to ensure that this continues to improve over time, even in more difficult contexts. So while resilience is often used to substitute the word adaptation, and particularly my institute, it's the concept of maintaining status quo that's implied with building resilience that I feel goes against what adaptation is about. So in attempting to adapt to climate change, activities must not reinforce or maintain existing inequalities, injustices, or environmentally destructive behavior. Instead, they have to adjust lifestyles and livelihoods to new climatic conditions, moving some way towards a new behavioral paradigm, which may move more slowly without significant change in existing patterns, or more rapidly with dramatic policy shifts. And I think this is also what links adaptation and development so strongly. So, while I don't think we should abandon our efforts to think conceptually about adaptation, I do agree to some extent with those who suggest that we need to move on. Nevertheless, we must realize that what is adaptation for some can mean increased vulnerability for others. And so for this reason, conceptual discussions on adaptation should shift from attempts to identify one definition towards seeking a framework for highlighting the different uses and understandings of it, so that we can together move forward from theory to practice. And so I want to thank you for coming, and this is my email in case you have any questions. I've unfortunately left all my cards somewhere. I can't find them, but that's my email. And I also want to mention that I have flyers for that book that I just finished with a 20% discount if anybody's interested. Why not mark it? And also a flyer for our new journal, which is called Climate and Development. So just to say that. Thank you.
At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned how your interests have been leaning towards more about how to facilitate communication between the different groups. Can you give us a teaser about how the social and cultural encounters are barriers to putting together?
So the original topic that I was thinking of. Well, in that case, what I'm really interested in is the role that, I'm particularly interested in the role that religion plays in influencing how people perceive the risks, both disaster risk or climate change risk, and how that influences what kind of actions they take to reduce their exposure to these kinds of risks. And then once something happens, so after a disaster, their interpretations of what's happened and how they then respond to that. But there's quite a lot of people now who are interested in looking at sort of culture and adaptation. And there's a Norwegian scientist, Karen O'Brien, if you want to look up, who's at the University of Oslo, who's working a lot on this topic and writing some very interesting things on it. So.
Yeah, there's always this debate between the amount of resources that we should devote in dealing with climate and adaptation versus whether it should just be a direct vulnerability reduction. And we'll deal with sustainable development, whatever that means, first. So I wonder how you handle that question, particularly from some infamous Scandinavian tall blondes who write bestseller books on that topic.
I guess, yeah, yes. So the question is really adaptation to climate change impacts versus vulnerability. Yeah, but that is, my argument is that we're more likely to fall into the trap of maladaptation if we focus only on the impacts of climate change rather than all of the reasons that people are vulnerable to climate change. And so I don't want to say that adaptation is development, because I think that that's not really true. But at the same time, if we can figure out why we're doing development so badly and why there's so many problems, I think we'll be able to adapt to climate change better. I don't think that if we ignore all of those development processes, globalization, everything that's going on, and we only focus on the impacts of climate change, we're not really going to we're not going to be able to reduce our vulnerability that much. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, one follow-up, because one of the things, I get in that fight myself all the time, is let's stop competing them. Let's just work every side of the street. The question is, what kind of resources are we going to need, quote unquote? I know there's no single answer to that. In reducing vulnerability, we're talking about the overall development agenda and reducing poverty, and that's a whole couple of orders of magnitude larger than what we're talking about in dealing with climate. So, is there any horse to ride for that kind of vulnerability reduction other than climate change then?
Well, that's a really good point. Yeah, and that's, I think, part of the problem is that we're trying to, this adaptation science, or whatever you want to call it, that's kind of cropped up, in some ways takes away from the development. And that's where the frustrating debate on whether we should use ODA for adaptation and whether development money should be used for adaptation or not, and where do you draw the line, and how much more money do you need to put on projects in order to make sure that they're adaptation to climate change and not just development projects. And I also see that it's a big puzzle and that there are little pieces and each of these activities fills in one of these pieces. But I think that, and I know that funding cycles are short and so on, but I think, ideally we should, and ideally probably doesn't make any sense, but we should try to think more long term, because we know that that's the only way that things are actually going to change. And also, my concern is that a lot of these adaptation projects, and I'm very uncomfortable using that because I don't think the idea of an adaptation project makes a lot of sense, but a lot of the adaptation projects think that they're going to somehow, invest a little bit of money and then there's going to be some kind of change that will last. But if they don't take into account all of these other processes, then how is that change going to last? And how can people actually how can their vulnerability to climate change be reduced? I just don't see that.
Did you have questions?
Yeah. So as I listened to you talk about different interpretations of adaptation or the different adaptation trends, it feels like everything you say about adaptation you could say about more sustainability. And if that's in fact the case, there's something actually more going on here than just the issue of adaptation. There's a way in which the discourse about these issues gets really skewed in certain ways.
Yeah, well, yes, I think the problem is that, well, like I tried to explain, that really everybody is trying to find some grasp at some adaptation straw, essentially, and kind of define it. Okay, this is what we're doing, and therefore this is adaptation, and that's what adaptation is. And because it's such a vague kind of process, I do work on adaptation, but I get really frustrated when I have to go to meetings, sort of donor coordination meetings, which is what they have in Bangkok, where all the donors sit together and talk about climate change and their adaptation activities. And I don't want to hear what they're saying, because I feel like they really, they have their money and they need to use it before the end of the year, and therefore they want to get some adaptation project going. And then you ask our advice, and what should we do? And, you can't just, within 7 months do adaptation, but this is how it's being understood in many ways. And so I guess what we're trying to do is raise awareness, particularly of that kind of community, to see that adaptation is in fact just a process, and that there are all these different things that need to happen under it, and that we can't just do adaptation projects like that. But yeah, it's going to happen because it's the trendy thing right now. And so there's money going in their adaptation funds. But hopefully, by raising awareness about this, people will think a little bit. But yeah, I don't know if that is an incomplete answer, but I don't think there is a complete answer to that question, maybe.
I agree fully with you that you ought to move into the vulnerability area. But what scares me in this whole area is there's a huge portion of the development industry that thinks of development as making them like us. And that goes absolutely counter all the vulnerability stuff. After all, China's developing, India's developing, they're moving to more meat, they're buying more cars, and so on and so forth. And I don't know how you try and solve that, but let me tell you, it's a tough problem. I've talked to whole groups of development experts, and my theme is always, what if you succeed? What will be the results? And they don't want to think about that. And I don't know whether that enters into your, if you get mixed in with that crowd, you might find yourself having a very hard time dealing with any real effects of vulnerability.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, and I agree, and I think maybe there are two hooks there, and one is that these development people are talking about climate change and adaptation, and there's sort of, they need some kind of something to guide them because they don't really know. I mean, they're taking up their own idea of adaptation, but the other thing is also that if we talk about vulnerability reduction, talking about reducing exposure and sensitivity, what I always try to underscore for all of them is that development is not necessarily going to reduce vulnerability. So all development is not good for reducing exposure and sensitivity to climate change. And that's usually one of the first things that I say when I meet those kind of people, just because building roads all over the place is not necessarily going to help anything. In fact, that might just create more floods or so on. So it's the kind of activities that you do that will affect that. But yeah, I mean, sure, we're not going to be able to convert everybody.
I wasn't expecting to have a strict answer.
No, but I know what you mean, because that's the community that I work in a lot, and so it's...
We're moving tens of millions of people within 2 meters of sea level in Asia megadeltas. This is not a very smart development.
So, well, on that same note, in your research, have you encountered any case studies or good examples of groups or governments that have specifically focused on the behavior change type of adaptation, which you talked about, which would be the kind of counter, which is focusing on behavior change in the developing world as a form of adaptation? I don't know if there are projects or big campaigns that you could hold up as an example, or...
I wouldn't... I can't think of that many good examples, but what I was involved in a project last year that was funded by Prevention Consortium, which is a kind of an organization that works on disaster risk reduction. And the idea was to look at 10 years after Hurricane Mitch, which happened in 1998 in Central America, and to look at, during these 10 years, what had the recovery process been, and had people learned from this recovery process. And of course, my interest in that project was looking at how did this relate to adaptation to change, and were people actually taking on these changes? And I think we found that while a lot of people had learned about hurricanes and risk, people still moved back to the same locations, even when they had sort of communities that were rebuilt in places. And so this kind of behavioral change, I mean, over 10 years, obviously, it wasn't happening. Maybe it had happened 2 years after, but then they all moved back because that's where they wanted to be, because that was close to the land that they were cultivating, or maybe close to where they were fishing or whatever. So it really, I think, but maybe the efforts there in Nicaragua, this is only Nicaragua, maybe those efforts hadn't been specifically focused on trying to change behavior, or maybe they hadn't used the right kind of techniques to change behavior. But there was quite a funny cartoon that was shown, because we were there in October last year for this 10-year anniversary. And in the newspaper that day, they had a cartoon that showed a family sitting on a roof. And it was sort of split down the middle, and it was the same family sitting on a roof. And the one, it said October 1998, and then it said October 2008. And the same bubble went to the two families and said, next time, we're going to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Clearly showing that within Nicaragua, the attitude was that things weren't really changing. So that's the closest I've come to, and I can't think of anything else that's been very focused on that kind of behavioral change, because that usually takes so long, and people don't have time or budgets for that kind of effort.
Unfortunately, I missed the beginning of your talk, so you may have covered this or not. In your work and your book and so on, is there a useful distinction you could draw between the rural setting and the urban setting? I think what we're seeing in the U.S., the IB field, is a lot more interest in city studies sponsored by cities and city splendors, partly because it enables you, I think, to go across the different impacts and sectors a little bit more easily. Number one, and also you have kind of governance issues and so on. Does that exist in Asia? Do you see that as a potential way to get greater focus? This actually relates to some of the global modeling as well, because people try to integrate at a global scale, and it's really hard to integrate climate impacts at a global scale. It's probably nonsensical. So some people think just as an analytic exercise, you need to kind of do that at a more local, regional, and hopefully the climate models will be able to do that, or at least there'll be some way to scale it. Did you talk about that, or is that something you see in Asia as a attractive thing to latch onto? And obviously the government people aren't there, and cities aren't there forever either, but some of the planners at least hang around long enough that they'll see some of the maladaptation things come out. I'm actually tempted to tie this to Paul's question, because then another question is, for development reasons, do you really want to do this virtualization or not? I have no idea what the answer is.
Well, I can't remember exactly when you walked in, but one of the trends in adaptation at the moment is cities in adaptation. And I have I've looked a little bit at that, although I usually stay away from those kind of urban things just to somebody else working on it. But I think what's really interesting is that when you talk about rural adaptation, you're really talking a lot about farmers. And of course, in cities, it's not the same kind of, you have people who aren't really as dependent on resources in the same way. They're not as directly dependent on resources.
Yeah, although in New York City, as you know, the big thing is the gross backed up sewer scenario that has a little bit of sea level rise and change in storm tracks. And it isn't like this isn't already a problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, where I live in Bangkok, there isn't any drainage. So when it rains, you have just seas of water, and then they send out these email alerts: don't walk in the water when it collects. But there's nowhere else to walk, so because there are some diseases that rats get anyway. And but I think it's let's see. This issue of the kind of priorities that people have in cities versus in rural areas, of course, different. And so it is interesting to look at why, how do you frame adaptation discussions in cities? What are the differences? And most of the work that's been done on adaptation has focused on rural areas, of course. So, I mean, especially in developing countries. So it's interesting to see this work that's coming out. And I don't have a huge amount of, a huge background in that, but I do think it is interesting in terms of planning. There's so many other ways that you can also combine greenhouse gas reduction efforts with adaptation efforts in a city, whereas in a rural setting, you don't really have that option. So where you might have more investment in mitigation activities, you could then combine those with adaptation activities, possibly.
I find myself thinking about why you picked this picture for us. And it raises the question of how migration fits into adaptation studies.
I picked this picture because it's sort of me escaping from the auditorium when this is finished. But migration is obviously a big issue, especially in, well, where I live and many other places too.
Do people consider it to be an adaptation strategy? Is it even in the discussion?
Yeah, it is in the discussion. But I think there's not necessarily full agreement about how migration can be used. I mean, I'm not sure if you're familiar with, there's a lot of discussion among the small island developing states in the UNFCCC process and climate change policy process in terms of, at the last meeting in Poland last year, the Maldives had announced that they're actually looking for land in other places. They're going to buy land in other countries so that when they're no longer there, they have somewhere else to live. And then there was a press conference where the executive secretary of the UNFCCC had made a comment that migration is giving up. Migration, and sort of saying that it's not really an adaptation. It's just a way, it's kind of our last resort. And a journalist from Samoa came up to me and she said, I really need a statement on this because we don't want it to look like migration is sort of our last resort. And okay, it's our last resort, but it's not giving up. For them, it's a really serious first option. And so I think there's still some kind of discussions around how it fits into adaptation, because obviously, for people who have to leave entire countries, where do they go? And what kind of pressure and additional pressure do they put on other people? And how would they then maybe increase their vulnerability to change in climate? So I think, yeah.
Thanks. The aha I got last night was when you described the difficulty in trying to change, not just moving somebody into a less vulnerable position, but changing the direction of things. What Paul said, because we have the same problem in transport. Little patches like we just put in our green tram, but everybody's still taking their car. What you get with transport is you can't really just fix a widget or an engine. You really have to change the direction of the whole system. You can't take a green stimulus and fix everything. And can you just fix or help vulnerability and adaptation within development context if all the other things are going kind of in the wrong direction? Can you do it one time by saying here's a grant? Or does the president, the electorate, the people that have the power really have to decide to develop differently?
Yeah.
The honest question is, will they?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. That's the problem. And I think that was also what Steve was saying in terms of where do you focus? Is it on the adaptation to the impacts of climate change, which could, be putting in a tram, for example, in this analogy? Or how do you focus on kind of changing this paradigm? But we know that we're not very good at affecting that paradigm. It takes a long time. So how do we, I don't know, what are your answers in the transport sector? You must be able to, I mean, I think there are parallels in terms of those kind of, questions, because that's where the problem is in terms of sustainable development, which, how do we do that? So that's another question to answer your question.
So on that note, why don't we thank Lisa so much for your talk.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.